Hello, everybody. We just want to welcome everyone to this panel discussion titled Charting Renewal. We really do want to thank you for taking this time to participate. My name is Devin Patton, and I will be moderating this event. And I must say, on behalf of Syracuse University, we'd like to acknowledge this with respect to the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. And this panel discussion, as you know, is on charting renewal, which is part of the ongoing City Scripts initiative, a partnership founded in 2017 between Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and the School of Architecture to explore politics, policy, and of course, city design. And just like a budget expresses the values of government and people, a city's design expresses values and ideas about how people should live together and interact, and who is included. And you can learn more about City Scripts by visiting cityscripts.syr.edu. Now, this particular discussion, as many of you know, is about I-81, the tearing down of I-81, the rebuilding and the redevelopment of its on-the-ground footprint, as it's been called, a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the city of Syracuse. But like any project this big, it also carries a risk for the community. Our panelists today will explore some of those opportunities and challenges. Now, they come at the request from different disciplines, perspectives, and experiences as well. First, you're going to hear their views, and we'll give them a chance to respond and react to what they've heard from each other. And then we want to hear from you. But before we get started, we have to give some brief thanks to the organizations and the people who have made City Scripts and this charting renewal discussion possible. First, we'd like to give a big thank you to the Kresge Foundation, American Cities Program, especially Joy James, the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, and Dean David Van Slyke, the School of Architecture at Syracuse University, and Dean Michael Speaks. Faculty founders Lawrence Davis, Carol Faulkner, Elizabeth Kamel, Grant Rear, and the staff that includes Madeline Hamlin, Prerit Gupta, Andy Malloy, Tuck Fung, and Julie Sharkey, and Kelly Coleman. Of course, we're going to hear from the panelists now. And then in turn, we're going to start with Elizabeth Cohen, an historian from Harvard University, where she holds the Howard Mumford Jones Scholarship. She's also the author of Saving America's City, Ed Logue, and the struggle to renew urban America in the suburban age. Right now, I'm just going to pass it along right now to Elizabeth Cohen.
Thank you, Devin. Now let's see, I guess I'll share my screen, get that done. Sorry about this, just trying to get the. Okay, is that working?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, is that on the filling the screen? Doesn't look quite from my end. Is that right? Can somebody?
You got it up nicely. It looks good.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. And I wanted to thank the organizers for including me in what I think is a very important discussion about the opportunities and pitfalls that the city of Syracuse faces with this, with the upcoming decisions about the future of the highway and then the adjacent neighborhood. Okay, let me just go back here. I'm not a planner, as you heard. I'm an historian. And I was invited to join you this evening because I've recently published this book, Saving America's Cities, that Devin mentioned. And in it, I investigate the complex history of urban redevelopment since World War II. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that the organizers of today's events understand that while the past doesn't repeat itself, as is a common cliche, and it doesn't predict the future, it can provide important insights to guide our decisions in the present. So my book uses the long career of a man named Edward J. Logue, and you see his picture there at the site of the Boston Government Center as it was going up. And he's at the center of this story, and he was an important figure in urban redevelopment from the 1950s through the 1980s. And I use him as a way of tracking the evolution of thinking and policies around renewing cities. Logue worked first in the 1950s in New Haven, and then he moved to Boston in the 1960s. From there, he headed to New York State to take on what was his biggest job, heading the New York State Urban Development Corporation, which was known as the UDC, and he did that from 1968 to 1975. And I should point out that among the UDC's many projects, altogether they created more than 33,000 units of subsidized housing in the state, were 3 new towns. And one of those new towns was Radisson outside of Syracuse. And these all were mixed income, mixed use communities, new communities. Logue's last major job was heading the South Bronx Development Organization, which he did from the late 1970s to the mid 1980s. As I investigated Logue's work over at least 4 decades, I came to several conclusions that I think are relevant to our discussion here tonight and to the story, to the challenges you face here in Syracuse. The first conclusion is the following. What is frequently labeled and summarily dismissed as misguided urban renewal throughout time, but throughout the post-war period, I argue in this book, was actually more complex and evolutionary over time. It looked very different in the 1970s than it had in the 1950s. And many of those shifts were actually improvements. For example, New Haven and Boston in the 1950s undertook urban renewal at its very worst, featuring massive clearance with large amounts of displacement of residents, and often the replacement of low income but still viable neighborhoods with high-rise housing, which was aimed at keeping the middle class in the city as it was fleeing to the suburbs, and also with reconstructing retail downtown as downtown stores were struggling with the challenges of suburban shopping centers. And you can see the New Haven there on the left. And Boston's West End is there on the right. Both cities had very common stories. And this was very typical of the disastrous urban renewal of the 1950s, which we properly condemn today. But by the 1960s and 70s, things were starting to unfold differently. And urban renewers like Logue learned some important lessons, I think, from their mistakes that they had made in the 1950s. First, they learned that they had to work more closely with communities. They also learned that tearing down and destroying the existing, often historic urban fabric was misguided. And increasingly, they preserved older buildings, such as with the renovation of the 19th century Sears block, which you see there on the left, which was next to the new Boston City Hall, and the Quincy Market on the right, which was eventually also renovated. They also learned that building more subsidized housing needed to be a top priority. And I should say that in Logue's case, his preference was always for mixed income, mixed race, mixed age, And in the case of one of the other new towns, Roosevelt Island in the East River of New York City, he created a situation where disabled people were also integrated into the housing. Logue felt that low-income residents would benefit from proximity to the amenities like good schools, access to transportation and retail, and so forth, that middle-class residents demanded. But he also felt it was crucial to preserve low-income people's rights to be there. Redevelopers like Logue over time learned that the design of housing mattered and that residents needed to be part of that design process so that the housing that was built worked for them. And Logue also learned, but regrettably over time, this hope was really very disappointed, that the public sector must stay in the driver's seat and not cede authority and responsibility to the private sector, which he felt rarely put the public interest over private profit. The second conclusion that I come to and I would like to share is that urban administrators, redevelopment administrators like Logue learned the lessons that I just laid out because communities had also learned from the disasters of the 1950s, and they had learned to assert themselves in new ways. Neighborhood residents came to recognize that they had to demand a voice for themselves and not just let so-called community leaders speak for them. They learned how to negotiate better with City Hall, and redevelopment authorities learned that they had to give people what they wanted if they were going to have any success. The strategies that communities employed were often a very careful balance between public protests, like you see here in the Allston neighborhood of Boston, and constructive negotiations. Prospective residents also knew more than planners ever expected about what they wanted the design of new housing to look like. For example, in Boston, when the grassroots Lower Roxbury Community Corporation explained what its members wanted in the new housing that they had worked very hard to secure in the Madison Park area, a white activist who had helped their effort but was not from the community was surprised at what they advocated. And he remarked, and I quote him, "We all thought it was rather unimaginative, but that's what they wanted. I mean, we had visions of compounds and inner courtyards and so on. They wanted housing with their front on the street and a backyard," end quote. And similarly, in another neighborhood, another community-driven project in the south end of Boston, Villa Victoria, the predominantly Latino future residents told the architect what they wanted, and that was that they wanted paved, tree-sheltered outdoor gathering places as were common in Puerto Rico and Mexico. And in some, and this is the important point, greater resources were welcomed by these communities, but the issue was on whose terms. One community activist in New Haven said, "We even welcome expert advice in improving our housing and our schools." But he added, and I quote him, "We must have experts who will plan what we want instead of what the people downtown want," end quote. In conclusion here, then, let me say that I'm not trying to argue that urban redevelopment was perfect by the 1970s, but I think we should acknowledge that there was growth and learning on the part of both city officials and communities, and that together they evolved and improved what had been the worst abuses of the 1950s. Tragically, I would point out that just as there was this kind of recognition that there might be a better way to do this, President Richard Nixon and successor administrations, particularly under President Reagan, severely reduced federal funding for urban housing and instead increasingly shifted responsibility and solutions to the private sector. So what does this all mean for Syracuse's challenges today as the city contemplates the potential opportunities and pitfalls accompanying Blueprint 15. My message would be this: we can learn from history not only to avoid the mistakes of the past, but also to seize new opportunities as they appear. Particularly as we see some promising movement in Washington around this infrastructure bill, I think it would be foolhardy to avoid taking advantage of the availability of greater resources to improve housing in neighborhoods out of fear of repeating the mistakes of the past. Rather, I would hope we can learn from these mistakes to do it better and imagine an urban renewal that makes sure that the planning process is as inclusive as possible and seriously engages with current and future residents. An urban renewal that creates safeguards to minimize displacement of existing neighborhood residents. An urban renewal that guarantees the right to return for those who may temporarily lose their current housing. And one that carefully calibrates the balance between subsidized and any market rate housing to protect those with the lowest incomes, while, if possible, creating more socially integrated communities so desperately needed in our country that is still so segregated by income and by race. But I think we have to think very carefully about the delicate staging of mixed income projects, not favoring one market over the other and thereby running the risk that the mix never happens. We must think carefully about design and avoid imposing architects and planners' prescriptions of what residents should want in their homes, but rather we should ask them themselves. And finally, I would say that not all public housing is beyond repair. It's been a travesty that we have allowed it to deteriorate to the level we have. There has been very little funding to actually do maintenance and improvement on urban housing. But I think in the new infrastructure bill, there is money to tackle much deferred maintenance in the best of public housing that was built from the 1930s onward. And I think that we should still do what we can to make the very best of what could be very desirable housing still today. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth Cohen. Very nice presentation there. And I must add that if some of you are wondering, this event is closed captioned. If you need that, as well as it is being recorded and will be posted online afterwards. And you guys are pretty good because I forgot to mention everybody should mute your audio so that people can hear the presentation, and you've done that. So thank you so much. There will be a question a time, and if you want to get your question chat once our speakers are done. As you just heard, our first speaker, Elizabeth Cohen. Our second speaker is going to be Lawrence Vail. Associate Dean Lawrence and Ford Professor of Urban Design and Planning at MIT. Whenever I hear MIT, I'm like, wow, this guy must be awesome. He's at MIT. When I grew up, everybody talked about MIT as like the place to go to if you're the smartest guy. And I'm just amazed. Anyway, he has served as head of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning from 2002 until January of 2009. He is a director of Resilient Cities Housing Initiative, RCHI, a unit of the School Center for Advanced Urbanism. I could go on and on, but I think we want to hear more about what Lawrence Vail has to say. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you, Devin. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be on a panel with Liz Cohen, who I think has a very complementary kind of work to what I'm talking about. So as the stakeholders in Syracuse are pondering the future of public housing that you can see behind I-81 in the photo that I'm sharing, and the prospects for mixed income housing, I think there's a lot that can be drawn upon for other American cities, both for good and for ill. And I want to situate this in the context of the Hope 6 program of public housing redevelopment that between 1992 and 2010 redeveloped 260 developments around the country, totaling more than $6 billion. The HOPE in that official HOPE 6 acronym evolved over time, but was mostly translated as housing opportunities for people everywhere. But others question who would receive these opportunities and who would not. In some cases, the more cynical might say that the HOPE in HOPE 6 could be more aptly translated as house our poor people elsewhere. And to some, that kind of phrasing would sound harsh and be seen as equivalent to unwarranted displacement. But to others in positions of power, moving the poorest out of public housing was thought to be in their own best interest. Anywhere they would go would be better than the conditions they were leaving behind in the developments that had suffered from both deferred maintenance and ongoing violence. So redevelopment of public housing then and now has been complicated and controversial. In some cities and in some neighborhoods within them, the HOPE 6 program and the successor program called Choice Neighborhoods has been seen as a land grab by developers. When the investment finally comes to long neglected places, it's benefiting chiefly the newcomers rather than the people that suffered through the worst circumstances. And then those newcomers are mostly higher income. And sometimes the message is often quite explicit. The new mixed income neighborhood is simply too good for poor people. I've written about this kind of displacement in the book Purging the Poorest, but I've also written in the more recent book After the Projects about some other places where very low income households were treated better. So the question for me is, how will Syracuse fare with Blueprint 15? What lessons could be drawn from other places? This program that I said, HOPE 6, that allocated $6 billion to redevelop these housing sites were very controversial in their local communities, and certainly among the more progressive critics who saw displacement and loss of deeply subsidized units. At the same time, they were also criticized from the right for being so inefficient and so delay prone. I consider HOPE 6 as neither a wonderful success nor a completely unmitigated evil. Instead, I think it's a highly varied and variable program that got implemented quite differently in different city neighborhoods. And I've been trying to understand how and why that's happened. In many cases, the extremely low income residents, the people that I call the poorest, clearly lost out. But sometimes there have been more positive outcomes, outcomes that have preserved access to well-located public housing for those extremely low income people. So my question has been, wonder what conditions has it been possible for the leaders of some American cities to resist gentrification and to continue housing the poorest even after these projects are gone? So my first observation is that this HOPE 6 is not all the same. It's largely because mixed income housing is not all the same, even though we have this impoverished vocabulary that does not differentiate between vastly different kinds of mix. It varied a lot across the 260 developments. The chart that I've got up is showing the variation in the percentage of units by subsidy type in each of these HOPE 6 developments after that redevelopment was completed. So the medium gray is public housing. You can see it goes from like 100% to pretty much zero. The light gray is the shallow subsidy, so-called affordable housing, typically from tax credits. And then the black bars are the market rate housing. So it's clearly varying a lot. And that's why we called an article about it all mixed up. But mixed income housing is fundamentally about designing communities and not just housing. So who is getting included in these communities? Whose voices are mattering and shaping them? These are the processes that are not random, and they have a long history nationally and locally. So what accounts for the variation? Is it just the particularities of housing markets? Surely that's partly true, but if we focus chiefly on the subset of HOPE 6 that's in gentrifying areas or areas threatened with gentrification, the same variation exists. We have to understand the political history of every city, especially the experience of the urban renewal programs that Liz Cohn was just talking about, and the other clearance that was leading to mass residential displacement, like the coming of highways. More specifically, it depends on what the reaction was to that earlier history. To me, it's a question of changing governance. Most of the cities that constructed public housing during the mid-20th century did so during high modernist hopes for central city urban redevelopment and renewal. But in some cities, the renewal effort was large and backlash against it was strong in many places, especially during the 60s and 70s, or especially during the 50s, but continuing into the 60s and 70s in some places. In those places, it became possible where there was this backlash in learning to change some of the power structure of city governance enough to resist purging the poorest a second time. So this is the way I would answer my question. The interests of low-income people are best protected in places where there's been a constructive backlash against the past excesses of urban renewal, as well as taking advantage of what urban renewal produced. Many community-based organizations, not-for-profit developers, resident groups, city agencies that have a never again mentality. Not every place is going to need all of it, but none of it can happen quickly. So let me take the last few minutes to offer thoughts on three things that may be used to decision makers and community members in Syracuse. First, my worries, 5 lessons that I draw for Blueprint 15 based on my studies of past efforts to redevelop public housing and its surrounding communities. Second, a hope, an example that I followed for nearly 30 years in Boston that overcame those worries. And third, 2 challenges that face efforts to bring about mixed income housing. So here are some key thoughts that I have for Syracuse. First is this frequently heard phrase, right to return. In many cases, public housing redevelopment efforts begin with a statement about the right of residents in good standing to return. The fine print of what counts as good standing may be proving very daunting to meet. And then further, some of the replacement communities require new screening procedures or impose new expenses such as utility costs, or may have new rules that prohibit the sorts of gatherings like barbecues that were central to the social life in the development. These kinds of things are really very crucial. The right to return may be coupled with new barriers that make the return seem untenable. And then there's the promise of one-for-one replacement of housing units. The notion that efforts at mixed income communities will do this is not always the case. Sometimes they don't want to do this right to begin with, but sometimes others do promise a one-for-one replacement and then don't really do it, because you have to ask the difficult questions. Is it one-for-one replacement of units serving low-income, extremely low-income public housing residents, or is it simply one-for-one replacement of units serving those who are merely eligible for public housing, but might have incomes that are up to 80% of the area median? Or is it one-for-one replacement of the units, or actually one-for-one replacement of the bedrooms? In other words, will the new community accommodate large, very low-income families or not? Then there's this question of whether phased redevelopment, a term we often hear, can really facilitate the return of existing residents. In theory, it's supposed to allow families to remain in the neighborhood while the next phase is built, rather than clear the whole site and then just hope to be able to come back. But it's more expensive to build in phases, and the financing might not permit it. So related to that is the 4th lesson. It takes many years to redevelop communities, and it's very disruptive, especially for the lives of people already living in precarious economic circumstances. And then finally, there's often a tension between the expressed needs of the most affected residents and the major investment that is supposed to benefit something called the city. It's asking a lot to think about low-income people accepting their displacement is going to be for the good of the city. And yet there is often an overwhelming kind of confidence among project leaders that can sometimes come across as distant or even condescending, that the sense that, well, we know what's best for the city, and therefore this will be something that we know what is ultimately best for you. So those problems are a problem for me. Boston's experience with Hope 6, though, shows that it's sometimes possible to overcome these challenges. A lot of the public housing research has focused on cases where public housing ends up as a minority in a new mixed income community. But how is it that Boston's leaders chose to emphasize the role of public housing residents led by Edna Bino, shown here, and devote 85% of the Orchard Gardens development to public housing occupancy and keep inclusion of market rate units to a minimum? You know, my answer is that that relatively poor approach was the result of a much longer process of poverty governance. It was rooted in tenant organizing that resulted from the backlash against the perceived excesses of the previous urban renewal. And so this shared sense of responsibility for housing low-income people in Boston made it politically impossible to engage in mass displacement of the poorest. And so my research team has done about 125 interviews with residents and other key players over the last 25 years to try and understand this place that was built in the 1940s on a slum clearance site. There's the little buildings at the top, the four that allowed Black families, including Edna Bino, where she lived as a toddler in the 1940s. And then it shifted overwhelmingly to non-white occupancy in the 1960s. But it matters where it is in the city. It's not alone. At first, the urban renewal of the excessive part in the 50s was in the place called New York Streets, and then the one that Liz Cohn talked about, the raising of the West End, that was so well documented by planners and sociologists. This is what prompted the never again attitude in Boston. So by the time that Ed Logue comes in the 1960s at the Redevelopment Authority and has these ambitious set of projects, he's promising to engage in what he called planning with people. To me, that was still mostly planning focusing on middle and upper income people, but a lot of these projects impacted Orchard Park. So you have the South End project just north of it, and the Washington Park urban renewal just to the south. And on the other side, the one that was called Campus High School urban renewal. And this one was supposed to have the Madison Park High School, but no low-income housing at all. And the residents said, no, we need affordable housing. And so they added it at a place called Madison Park Village and launched a new organization, a community development corporation called the Madison Park Development Corporation. And that's what was surrounding it, in addition to the highway movements that were going on. The Southwest Expressway was going to bring I-95 into Boston. The Inner Belt Expressway was going to connect the various highways. These were going to go right past Orchard Park, but they were dramatically stopped by citizen protests, but not until a lot of land was cleared. And so even though there was some success, it marked an important aspect of resident empowerment in reaching that success. And the governance of the Housing Authority had its own version. It was the tenant-oriented majority board, including a resident from Orchard Park, who later came to head the Housing Authority. They couldn't control the executive director, and then the mayor at the time, Mayor White, lost all interest in the Housing Authority once this board proved to be too recalcitrant. The Housing Authority falls apart and goes into receivership by 1980. The kinds of things that were going on in Orchard Park were just horrific. All sorts of vacancies, 30 or 40%. But Harry Spence, as the receiver, and tenant leaders like Edna Bino were completely undaunted, and they kept insisting that redevelopment would be possible. The redevelopment did do other redevelopment in Boston, and they did 100% public housing constituency in 3 or 4 of them in other places like the Commonwealth development. And then on the other side of Orchard Park, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative launched a community land trust with eminent domain powers, another layer in the rise of rights of low-income residents. So it's all of these forces that were contributing over years before there was a Hope 6 to make that program more likely to focus on the needs of public housing residents. And then when they come to Hope 6, what do? They select a developer that is that old nonprofit Madison Park Development Corporation, the CDC developed in the urban renewal era, as the lead developer, the very organization that was spawned by the urban renewal effect that was there to protect the community when it got redeveloped. 70% of the households of the old Orchard Park were able to return to the new Orchard Gardens, about triple what went on. It remains a resource for low-income households. And it was part of this larger constellation of stars that were really there to build a social movement and a pro-poor form of poverty governance. It was rooted in the lessons of urban renewal, but it enabled an extremely low-income household community to remain in its neighborhood. Its political will to build a mixed income neighborhood that did not mix out the poorest. So let me just conclude with some thoughts about mixed income as a problem. It's hard to imagine implementing the Boston version in Syracuse, but there are these more general questions about mixed income. I see these two reasons why it's hard to see mixed income housing as a panacea or as the only way out. There are lots of mixes, and which are we talking about? How does this mix actually operate? Does it do what it says it's going to do? It's a single concept that is unhelpfully allowed to encompass everything from market rate developments with small remaining numbers of public housing units to developments that are chiefly public housing, to those that have few or no market rates and have a narrow income mix of low and very low income housing. So how do we know which kind of mixed income housing is needed to generate the gains that are proposed? And the issues are not just about what it is as a mix, but what it does. Do the outcomes match the claims? There's been a lot of work by Mark Joseph and Rob Chaskin and colleagues that studied the actual operations of many mixed income communities all over the country and found that there were 4 consistently proffered rationales, but very little support for the first 2. The scholars and practitioners continue to debate the merits of this, but repeatedly have found that many of the assumed benefits for low-income residents, such as role modeling and social capital, really don't tend to materialize and provide very little impact on their lives positively. The other things do seem to help. Enhanced security, investment in neighborhoods, higher expectations for management, and maybe more holistic investment in health and education will make an even bigger difference. But those are going to benefit who gets to stay in the community. So how do we justify this? At base, I'm left with these questions that I think are still worth asking. Why do we want mixed income communities? Who's going to benefit and who's left out? How do the benefits for the poorest get maximized, whether or not they can return to the redeveloped community? And then who is this we that should be deciding all this? In other words, who picks the mix? Ultimately, it's an underlying question of governance. Which question is being asked when making the decisions about which mix to pick? And so I see 2 questions, and which one are we going to ask? Instead of saying, how can the number of very low income households that need to be accommodated be kept to a minimum so that redevelopment is going to be financially appealing to private developers and investors? It's been possible for some mixed income community developers to ask a very different question. They're saying, well, what is the maximum number of equitably screened, very low income households that can be accommodated in a mixed income and mixed use development that still allows a safe and stable community? And so I think that there are a lot of push to minimize the presence of the poorest in mixed income housing, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so my hope is that Blueprint 15 will pick a more equitable mix. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry Vail. Very detailed information that you've been talking about there. I guess that one of the questions that came to mind as you were giving your presentation is, how do you make everybody happy? Which is basically mission impossible, but I guess that's what some of the higher ups are trying to do. More so now with what we've been seeing with Syracuse with how they have a lot of the meetings that have been happening throughout the communities. As many of you know, I'm Devin Patton. I'm with Spectrum News. I'm the morning anchor. And I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but apparently they have actually started tearing down I-81 to make way for the community grid. I know there's a lot of construction going on right now, but I don't know if you guys were aware of this. But they actually started tearing down part of I-81 to make way. And that was my failed attempt at an April Fool's joke right there. There you have it. April Fool's, everybody. And everybody was like, what? Yeah, gotcha. Some of you, maybe one of you, I don't know. Anyway, we're gonna move on to our next couple of guests here, respondents. Lanessa Chaplin, Esquire, currently project counselor for the New York Civil Liberties Union. She began her legal career in 2012 at Hiscox Legal Aid's Appellate Division, where she drafted appeals on behalf of inmates to right the wrongs of the lower courts. Her work with the incarcerated population sparked her interest in public policies. Lanessa has served as legal counsel to Assemblymember Sam Roberts and went on to serve as the Deputy Secretary to the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, working closely with anti-poverty initiatives and criminal justice reform. Lanessa, I'm going to give it to you, but before I do, I want people to know that you can ask questions through the chat later on in this presentation. So Lanessa, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the two really good and informative presentations. I think I learned some stuff, especially about Boston's history, so that was good information for me. I just want to take it back a little bit concerning Syracuse specifically when we're talking about the history of Syracuse. So I think it's really important to start at the ground level of like what we're talking about here, right? And like needing to address the impacts of redlining and how that impacted the Syracuse community and the Syracuse neighborhoods that we're specifically talking about now. So what we know is, as a result of redlining, which we don't have to go into because I'm sure that most folks here on this call know what redlining is and how it was a construct to keep Black and Brown communities in their communities and preventing them from moving into high opportunity white neighborhoods. 90% of the Syracuse population lived in what was known as the 15th Ward at the time of the construction of I-81. I also want to be clear that Blueprint 15 and I-81 are two completely separate projects happening in the same community. And so a lot of times we end up talking about those as if they're the same thing, and they're absolutely not. And both of those projects have their own individual responsibilities and accountability to that neighborhood that always do not align with one another. So I just want to kind of make that clear at the beginning of this. And I love to hear what you mentioned about in the 1970s, the lessons that they had learned around urban renewal. Unfortunately, the Black community didn't get to benefit from that. The Black and Brown communities didn't benefit from their new recognition of what they had done wrong. By then it was far too late. And what we know in Syracuse from a study that the DOJ did is between 1930 and 1960, the Black community in Syracuse lost 102 acres of land. That is an incredible, phenomenal amount of land to have lost just 57 years ago. And they're still struggling from the impacts of the loss of that land. And so I just kind of want to uplift that. This is where we're at. This is our starting point, right? They've been destroyed by urban renewal. They've been destroyed by the infrastructure build, and they are rebuilding back their communities. So I just kind of wanted to really start there. And also, they knew at the time it was happening, right? They didn't need to learn those lessons. They protested. They wrote articles in the paper. They congregated their elected officials. The elected officials made noise. They did a 24-hour protest in front of City Hall the day before construction was to begin on the original build. They were very well aware they were losing their community, and they fought tooth and nail to get it, keep it, and maintain it. Unfortunately, they lost. They filed lawsuits. They litigated. They argued how much money they were getting for their homes. There were so many things that were happening at that time, all well documented in reports and articles at the Downtown County Historical Association. I just kind of want to make that point there. Also, to the point of, it also was very intentional, right? So infrastructures was very intentional. Robert Moses in New York State was the person who led this effort. And he was very intentional on the record saying, this is to rid the slums, right? We need to break up these Black and Brown communities. He was very vocal at what his intentions were. So this wasn't kind of a mishap or a mistake that happened. This is very much targeted at communities of color because they had become overpopulated and they had become the slums. And so I just really, really wanted to uplift that. And also through the uses of land use regulations and zoning, which is a city's policing power. And so many of these things were controlled by land use and zoning laws, which were created by segregationists back in the 1920s, which were adopted nationally. So, you know, you saw from 1920 to about 1980, latest Georgia, 1997, they had that very blatant language about segregationists and why zoning was important to keep those neighborhoods separately. So I think that's the most important part I want to impart here. And the reason why I want to impart that, because now we're talking about mixed incomes. This brings me to Blueprint 15. So what we're talking about is mixed income, but our focus is on how can we integrate Black communities. The focus is not how can we integrate Black and white people. Our focus is how can we integrate Black communities. And I think the messaging, I think the language is very important, because what we're talking about again is displacement, right? But now we're trying to convince communities who remember this, right? They have psychological, emotional memories of being displaced all across the country. This is not unique to Syracuse or Rochester or Buffalo or Boston. This is a national issue. And so we're talking about, we want to displace you again, but this time you should trust us, because this time it's for your own benefit, right? But what we're not talking about is mixed income housing in white neighborhoods. Very rarely do we talk about, we need to integrate that suburban community. It's far too white. There's way too much opportunity here. We need to integrate. Even when those white communities are in urban centers, we don't talk about integrating those communities. And so what does that say to Black people? What does that say to people of color? It gives the perception that we are innate objects that can be moved to the benefit of other people. And we at some point will receive some ad hoc benefit from living next to a person who has more money than us. And that is a concept that if you've ever lived in poverty or have experienced folks who lived in poverty, their dollar amount does not make them feel impoverished. And just a little bit about me, we've been in this community for almost 3 years now, knocking on doors, canvassing, having workshops weekly until the pandemic, and we transferred those workshops to online workshops, Zoom meetings. Very much this community is rich. And if you ask them, how do you feel? They feel rich. We want more resources. We want more investments here. We don't want our neighborhood torn down and then redeveloped into something new. Because what that psychologically tells folks is, if you want your community to have value, you must allow white people with more money to move into your neighborhood. That is the underlining message. That is the emotional connection that people hear when they think of integration. And that's what we have to deal with, right? It has to be explicit, it has to be intentional, and it really has to be the community leading the effort. And I like what you said, I think it was Elizabeth, you said people wanted their doors at the front of the house and backyards, right? This has to be led by the community. This is the only way we'll ever be successful. If it even could be successful at all. So I don't want to give the impression that there is a successful method to this until we start making it more equitable. And it reminds me a lot of when we were working on integrating schools. The idea had become, let's not fully resource Black and brown schools, but let's put 6-year-olds on buses for an hour and a half and put them in an all white school so then that they can learn and have that educational opportunity. We now know that was a failure, right? And we now have more segregated schools, at least in New York State, than we did then, right? Because that's not the method that we need to be approaching. We don't want to give off the impression in which we have been, and I say we, not me, right? This country has been giving off this this methodology of like, we can fix you or we can fix this, instead of allowing people the breath to be able to fix themselves. And so I will say this, the infrastructure project I-81, the viaduct is coming down, right? It is an atrocity. It's an injustice from the original build. And it's creating a lot of, I'm an environmental law, so it creates a lot of pollution in that community that doesn't need to be there. And so we want the viaduct to come down, but it has to happen equitably. The resources have to be really, really flooded into this community for this to be successful. And so what I would leave with this comment is, what my thoughts on this is, if it's not community led, if it's not community driven, that we need to rethink the investment and time we're putting into the project. Because yet again, you're asking folks to move out of their homes, even if temporarily. That is a huge ask. And I think, Larry, you noted that this is a vulnerable population of people. And so to say, just simply move over here, and you'll be able to come back a little later, that's a humongous ask. And we would feel the pain if someone knocked on our front door and was like, hey, you need to move out for a year. And then you can come back, and it's gonna be to your benefit. But also there might be all these different conditions and strings attached to why, or can you come back? And we've seen the purpose-built communities all across this country come along with criticism. So I think Syracuse is gonna have like the 23rd or 26th, I don't remember, I know it's in the 20s, mid-20s, purpose-built community. Each and every purpose-built community has had their own string of criticism and controversy. And a lot of it comes with, once you put it into the private sector, you start to lose control of how they treat and serve the public. And what we know is private developers started putting certain strings attached, like you can move back in if you work at least 20 hours per week. Well, how does that jive with the disabled community? How does that jive with the person who doesn't have a job? Or you can move back in if you have at least a 620 credit score, where they have no credit. You can move in if you don't have any convictions on your record. But if they had a conviction yesterday, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you still need housing, and you're still from this community, and now you're being told you can't come back to your community because you don't meet a new standard. And that standard is precedent on, now you have white people living there too. So now you have to be a certain type of Black person to live in this community. And that's where the problem lies. I'll shut up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for that very enlightening conversation there that you basically started here with this panel and this presentation. And thank you for what you are doing in the community where you are and around the state here. So, wow, a lot of eye-opening discussion that you just started there, and hopefully we'll continue that. Next, we have John Washington, another respondent here. Again, if you have questions for our presenters here, you can do that through the chat. But again, John Washington, an organizer and political educator with People's Action. Before moving to national work, John was an organizer and an organizing director with Push Buffalo. He worked on campaigns to pursue housing justice, climate justice, criminal justice, and economic justice. John has been a part of the leading national climate and housing justice legislation. He's focused on building the capacity and understanding of local leaders to catalyze lasting change, and is constructing a national campaign to redefine American public housing and to guarantee a safe, high quality, ecologically sustainable housing stock that will actually end homelessness. Applaud that effort. John Washington, take it away.
Yeah, no, really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And yeah, I have to say, like, I think this conversation really is just such an example of how little we have learned about the conversation about race in this country, and the gymnastics that folks will go through to re-explain what is American apartheid. And I think we need to get really comfortable with that word. I hate the word segregation, because segregation is the process, right? It's the act of separating people. But the system, the structure, all of it together is apartheid. And it's apartheid by race, class, gender, ability, age. And so when we talk about public housing, we got to go way back, right? And we have to start with where did public housing start? And where did Black people's relationship to northern cities start? So first off, public housing started to become built because the private market was unable to house people where major factories were. And in most industrial cities, public housing was built for low income or for new white folks who were coming into this country to work, right? And to work in this new industrial labor force of the North. And then in the Great Migrations, World War I, World War II, we have millions of Black people being bussed up to northern cities, being recruited from the South to be this new labor force as white folks are, as white men especially, are off at war. And so what we're really talking about is how this country continues to reconcile with the fact that we are not supposed to be here. And the way that we were originally brought to be here was to be an entirely controlled labor force. And so as the modern city has developed, planning, zoning, architecture, all of these things were designed around race. And we need to talk about that. We need to acknowledge that this country's housing system was built to segregate. It was designed from jump in every single way to segregate and meet the needs of white capitalists, white industrial capitalists, and that our entire cities were designed around that framework. Right? And really what we're talking about is the contradiction that came into play when World War II ends, right? And we have all of these white folks, all this white labor moving into spaces that there's now new white labor, because at the time, a lot of folks who would consider white now were not fully white. And then we have, communities of color, mostly Black folks moving from the South and creating this vortex of racial dynamics. And so when we talk about public housing, we first have to talk about housing. Our housing system was designed to exclude Black people and to take away and give them as little wealth and as little power in the economic relationship to housing at every given level. And that hasn't stopped. So conditions in general have improved slightly, but the reality is the goal of our housing system is still apartheid. And this myth that putting people in proximity to whiteness is somehow going to save them is a racist fallacy that is designed to trick Black people into letting white folks into their neighborhood, because incomes don't mix. That's not how capitalism works, period. And that's what we call it gentrification. The word gentry refers to people who own land and benefit from rents. Those folks do not want poor people. They want rich and wealthy customers like any other business. And this is all about a profit-centered model that is designed to create homelessness, right? Because homelessness drives demand. And that homelessness is designed to be concentrated for people of color. So when we talk about redlining, we're talking about something that was driven by American policy, right? It wasn't banks who redlined communities. It was the Federal Housing Administration. It was the infrastructure that was built around creating mortgages as a vehicle to suburbanize white folks, to suburbanize white wealth, and along with Robert Moses and others, to create a car-centered economy that has driven what we now call climate change, which to me is really the Earth's reaction to capitalism. And so without the fear of Black people, the fear of integration, there would be no car-centered economy because we wouldn't have the suburbs. Without trillions of modern day dollars of going into essentially free mortgages for white folks post-World War II, we wouldn't have these dualities and these same dynamics in cities. So Black people enter public housing in that part of the story, right? In this era of civil rights, when now as a nation, we have returned from these wars and are figuring out how to exist with each other. And I want to also name the deep brutality and the fact that lynching was not an abstract concept, right? It was a consequence of racial integration, and it was a warning to Black people not to build power, not to define their own destinies, not to define their own communities. And every single time those destinies and communities were defined, they were erased, burned down, brutalized, and symbols of that brutality were left hanging from trees to let everybody know, Black people, you do not define your reality and you do not define your community. So we have to acknowledge that history as we talk about public housing. Now, as we enter the story in the Nixon administration, the Nixon administration has admitted, again, posthumously, that it designed the entire war on drugs to create a gaslighting framework to continue racism and mass incarceration. We're finally starting to have some real conversations about what that was like. So for me, public housing has been framed to be the blame and the scapegoat for American apartheid and for Ronald Reagan, the biggest drug dealer on earth, and his activities, his war against Black people all over the world, right? And the way that he used and manipulated Black and brown people across the world to create systems and structures to sell drugs, to build a military industrial complex. And in order to do that, destroying public housing was necessary to lay the groundwork and foundation for gentrification. And so, you know, when we talk about public housing, we have to separate the conversation about the actual housing from what was happening to the people in the housing. And to me, it's the equivalent of judging people for not being able to maintain structures during a war. Right? There always has been a perpetual war against Black people and Black and brown people in America. But the war on drugs was a specific, particular, and intentionally destructive war that was fought on the grounds of public housing. And I grew up in the 80s. My family is from Brooklyn, most folks from the Marcy projects. And so I know that my grandparents, they talked about the projects in the 60s and 70s as an entirely different thing before those 1980s hit. And most Black folk, you talk about what was done to our people during the 80s and 90s. That pretext that was really driven by narco-capitalism, by an international structure of bringing trillions of pounds of cocaine into our communities, the imagery that with the backdrop for that is public housing. And that is an association that we fundamentally have to break because there is this image of the welfare queen, of the poor folks, of the violence, of hip hop that really has to be separated from the decisions that the first two folks were talking about the intentionality around how to concentrate Black poverty and actually the benefit to a city that happens in the first stage of gentrification in using Black bodies to divest neighborhoods, to drive down real estate prices, only to set up the ability for public financing, public dollars, and public money to then rebuild the land and value of it. Because markets are based on fluctuation. So what they do is they use our bodies, they move us around to drive prices down, and then when they feel like it, they want to move themselves in to drive prices back up, which then drives Black folks out. And so at our Homes Guarantee campaign, we fundamentally believe that public housing was, as soon as public housing was not entirely centered around white workers, it never had a chance. And that all of these processes that other folks have talked about were deeply intentional. Those mistakes were people's lives. And the resistance to those mistakes being framed as a learning process really invalidates the pain, the trauma, and the death of urban renewal. Which really was foundational to the war on Black America between the 70s and 90s. So taking all of this into account, when we look at public housing, I believe that it is an enormous success that it still exists and that there still are people in public housing communities that have not only survived all of this, thrived on it, built power, and organized for this resistance. And what those people see is the history repeating itself. And it is nothing more than blatant lies and gaslighting to try to convince people that a process that happened before and displaced 1,300 people is somehow going to be different in this new future where real estate prices are higher, where there is a multi-billion-dollar university system, where there is all of these other assets and benefits. And I want to name a city's job is not to take care of its citizens. A city's job is to use its financial resources in order to create more financial resources. And that really is usually seen as a way to develop more services. But the reality is the modern city is about beer clubs, breweries, avocado toast. It's about attracting students who are great for the real estate market because they come in and out. They have access to wealth to pay for things. It's about bringing in people that the white gentry can manipulate into communities and redefining all of the spatial relationships around those people. And that is exactly what is happening here. It is history repeating itself. And I think the arrogance and absurdity of anybody who can say that is not exactly what is happening is offensive. And I think we really need to push back against these narratives. And when we start talking about solutions, The solutions are there. People know what they want where they live. They know what they need where they live. And people who have lived in public housing, especially over time, should be the ones not consulted, not engaged, not empowered, can't stand those words. They should be the ones directing the process. They should have the power of accountability. They should be able to snatch money back, fire people, cut checks, do all of the things that a CEO, that an executive, someone who gets to execute plans can do. And Black people as a whole have never, ever been given full executive powers. And we see that play out even among the richest and wealthiest classes of our people. So I think that ultimately, if we want to fix these problems, the answer is simple. We need to get rid of the planners, architects, academics, get rid of that entire class of people for a period, and allow these communities to define what their existence is, what their resources are going to be used for, and to define a relationship to every single process that happens along the way that creates real accountability. And real accountability only comes when I can tell you what you're going to do, or I can say you don't get paid anymore, or you're not a part of this project anymore, right? Real accountability doesn't come from engagements and meetings and consultation. It comes from power. And our housing system has created an intrinsic relationship between cities, their property taxes and their property values, and the real estate industry. And if we are to solve this problem, we have to acknowledge that there are a certain number of people in this economy who are going to become homeless, and it is our job to empower them, to give them the power to house themselves, to give folks in communities like this the power to define these projects, and to continue that flow, and to end things like LIHTC and all of these systems that privilege and benefit banks and this class of people that benefits from development far more than communities ever will benefit from. So I'm sure I've gone a little bit over my time, but the answer is really simple. Give the power and resources back to the people that you quote are supposed to be wanting to benefit. And how can you want to benefit someone and then entirely take all of the power of every process away from them?
Thank you so much, John. Very more enlightening conversation there. And we've already got some questions for you and Lanessa from the people who are listening into this presentation. I do want to remind people that if you want to send some questions, you have to do it through the chat. If your name starts with the letter A through L, you send your chat question to questions A through L. And if your first name begins with the letter M through Z, likewise. Right now we're going to start with a question from the people who are part of this presentation, listening in. This one is for Lanessa and John. So we'll start with you, Lanessa. The question here is, if you can give examples of your experiences of success, successful ways to incorporate community agency and voice, and how developers and city government can co-lead with the community. If you can expound on that or talk about that, if you will, Lanessa.
You know, interesting enough, I think John really touched on that on his last comment about making sure that the community has actual control over what they want. And there's a couple ways to do that. I mean, there's community land trust, which means you put the property put the actual parcels of land in ownership and control of the community. They get to decide what they want to do with it. This has been successful in places like Washington, D.C. There's a small pilot program in Tompkins County, which is Ithaca, our neighbor, and they're incorporating something like this in Albany as well. And so it is possible, and some communities are doing. Cincinnati is another example of community land trust. And essentially what that means is we're going to parcel out this land, and you decide what you want to do with it, and we'll provide the resources, right? So back to John's point, we're going to put this land back in your hands, right? Syracuse, we took 102 acres of your land. We'll give it back to you. We'll provide you with architects and developers and city assistants and agencies that can help you figure out what you want to do with this. Contrary to popular belief, from our experience and our canvassing, affordable housing was not at the top of folks' lists. That wasn't the thing that they wanted. They weren't asking for quality affordable housing. They were asking for grocery stores. They were asking for tailors. They were asking for amenities like a post office that they could walk to, really basic things. And so this idea that all we need to do is develop affordable housing and boom, racism is over, and poverty has ended, it's just simply not true. But what unfortunately, what we do know is when you integrate neighborhoods, those resources do start coming in. So that's the other thing, that's the other flip side of the coin. And I also wanted to just mention, because I think John kind of raised this to my awareness, is there's no magic pill to kind of teach people how to live next to each other. And what we're seeing in other places around the country that are doing integrative measures is there's a lot of hostility happening in those communities. You're having over policing. You're having policing, like I think Larry said, policing culture. You're having folks who are not accustomed to living around a group of Latinas calling the police because their music is too loud, or their party's gone over, or they're having a fiesta at a time and a date that they don't understand because it's not your traditional December 25th, right? They might celebrate on January 6th. And so there's a lot of things that have to happen culturally before we can start trying to push this initiative around integration when it comes to different races. And that's just simply because I think how John so eloquently said it, we've been segregated for so long that it's going to take some actual work for us to be able to live cohesively with one another. So I don't have any perfect examples. I'm not aware of any. I think that community land trust and letting the community decide what they want to do with the land is the best and most viable option. And then back to John's point, letting the community really lead it in a way that they have empowerment and they can actually have the authority to write the check and fire the folks who are involved in the project. That's really where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think it's important that we recognize that the goals of a city and the goals of poor people are not just in conflict, they are diametrically opposed, right? Cities want to raise property taxes, they want to attract new things in, they want to do all of these things. And really what happens when people mix is displacement, right? Because when we have apartheid, so white folks, especially privileged white folks, especially folks from universities, healthcare systems, big businesses, they have more power. So it's almost like, mixing humans and animals, right? Like, yeah, like, the dogs are going to get fed, but are they defining, their existence, and are they able to build sustenance? And I know that might seem like an extreme example, but integrating people does not remove the apartheid that they exist in and the reasons why they're poor. It doesn't change the fact that Black women make 62 cents on the dollar to white men. So you put a white man next to him, and now that person just sees somebody who has way more access and way more wealth, and then the world orients to that white male psychology. So then the grocery store is a Whole Foods instead of the bodega that folks were used to, that they may have wanted just a little more healthy food in. And so these things don't mix well. And I don't think that we actually need to perpetuate segregation. First, we need to heal what's happened. So I believe I read an article that said that there were 1,300 Black people that were displaced originally by the I-81. So I think we could do the math of those 1,300 houses and how they would have appreciated in value over the past, let's say 50, 60 years. And I think we should find those folks and cut them checks for what their houses should be worth right now. I think we should acknowledge that the resources, especially federal, state resources that are being used from this, are the tax dollars. And in the logic of the applications, all that language says it's to benefit these folks. So I've worked on, establishing the Fruit Belt Community Land Trust and mini land trusts. Those are great ways to mitigate some of the harm that's been done, give folks a little more power. But the reality is we got to go back to what originally happened and start to repair and heal those wounds. And then we have to acknowledge that giving someone a cheaper rent is not going to make them make more money. It's not going to give them more access to all the other things that they need in life, and process that in a way that brings those resources to people, uplifts their engagement with them, and allows them to benefit from them over time.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. Elizabeth Cohen, I've got a question for you. This one coming from Marlene McFarland. She's asking if you think that creating a community land trust has value in the Blueprint 15 project area.
I can't really, I'm not an expert on Blueprint 15, so I'm certainly convinced by what we're hearing from Lanessa and John, who do know the specifics much better than I do, that it's a really viable strategy. I don't feel like I can speak specifically. It's certainly, I agree with everything we've said about the success in many other places of land trust. So I think but it's just one, I'm obviously very moved and feel, the power of what John and Lanessa have said. I would be personally interested, if I can even throw it back a little bit, to find out in the 3 years of surveying that you've been doing, Lanessa, the kinds of things. I was glad to hear you talk about the grocery stores and post office and the kinds of things people really do want. Because I fear that if we need to make this happen, and if our objectives are so radical, which they should be, I'm convinced, but we also have to get there, and we need to have a viable path to it. So I wondered what some of the other things are that you've discovered people really want to see happen with this project.
Okay, should I answer that? I don't want to go off.
Like you too?
I don't want to go off.
Yes, Lanessa, go right ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I think a lot of what we were hearing and experiencing is they really wanted to have some autonomy in their community. They really wanted to have a well-resourced community. What it boiled down to was like mom and pop shops. They want to be able to walk in their neighborhood again, right? Go to the tailor. A lot of things that, I think if you're in a community that has those amenities, you don't think about. A bookstore, I heard some folks say. The opportunity to build equity, right? The opportunity to build wealth, pass something on to their children. And so that's why we started thinking about a land trust, right? Because now we're talking about building back the wealth that was lost. And so a lot of them were who we spoke to, and I don't ever want to imply I spoke to the whole community. That's just impossible to do, right? But we did speak to a couple hundred people, and we have over 3,000 submitted comments as a result of our conversations. And so what I will say is a lot of it was they wanted to be able to build some type of equity. That's what I heard with my legal mind, as they were saying they wanted to be able to go to a tailor, a Black-owned barbershop, a Black butcher, very, very kind of localized resources, a bookstore, a cultural center, a community center. They wanted access to additional, like a water park. I heard some folks say, we want a water park here. There's been buildings of water parks throughout our county. So that was kind of like the buzz of last summer, but they wanted a water park. I think very, very, very simple things that you would find in your everyday well-resourced neighborhood.
This question is for anybody who wants to kind of take a stab at this one. This is from Eddie Velasquez. He asked, knowing that federal funds is kind of unreliable in terms of timeliness and equitable distribution, how can communities and community leaders defend themselves and plan for a future where federal funds might not be there? Anyone?
Yeah, I think the simplest answer is we have to fight for federal funds, and we have to elect representatives who are going to think about this problem through a different lens. And I think, Biden's plan definitely, when it comes to numbers, is starting to match that. I think that we're seeing more Keynesian economics, more of an ideology that we have to make in massive investments in infrastructure. I just think that also, how much do those funds matter if we don't actually control them? So I think there's a fight for federal funds. And I also think that we really need to end LIHTC and repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment. I think when we talk about public housing being divested from, what we're not talking about, the fact is that LIHTC actually pulls money from that same pool to create what is not permanently affordable housing. And in the scheme of things, 15, 25, 30 years is really not that long. We're talking about a 60-year arc that we're talking about here. So with this particular project, so I think that we really need to start investing in permanently affordable housing and also giving people a flexible range of income, because what affordable housing is transient, right? If I make $15 when I go in and I get a raise to $18, I'm out. I immediately get evicted from it. And so the reality is people think that affordability is something it's not. It is not stability. It is only stability if you stay in the same economic position. And then what it does to people is, okay, I got $3 more an hour. Now I lose $20,000 in benefits, right? And now, even though I'm kicked out and now I'm out, that's how people end up working homeless. So we need to really just redo, and please check out our Homes Guarantee campaign, but we really need to redo some of this mathematics at the federal level. And I think that once we start investing in permanent affordability, we'll see much longer lasting and more efficient results in the investments in housing.
I've got a question for anyone to kind of step up here. Are there lessons from the Dudley Street neighborhood for Syracuse, such as land trust or negotiating? Are there any lessons from the Dudley Street neighborhood for Syracuse, such as land trust or negotiating with the city? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Since I mentioned them, and I think it's a wonderful example and certainly has inspired a lot of community land trusts around the country. But I also want to just, put in a plug for the people next door in the public housing. I totally agree with what Lanessa and John have said about the track record here and the reasons for deep mistrust over, and the fundamental questions being race and power. But the example, and I gather my slides didn't advance properly, but the example that I was giving of Orchard Park to Orchard Gardens was meant to be a counterpoint to this, because it is an example where Black women working the system successfully managed to be in charge of the project, where everybody was there, where they insisted that the developer be a developer of color, a nonprofit developer that came out of the community, where they, over decades, convinced the mayor's office to pay attention, and where every single player in this public housing redevelopment that had been one of the most vilified places, one of the most victimized by all the drug things that you were describing, John, they overcame that and they exercised their power, and they brought back 85% of the housing for public housing residents of extremely low incomes. And they brought back 70% of the residents, the people who wanted to come back to us. So I guess the question is, do we care if there are some examples where this transfer of power, and that's what it is, actually happened? And do we want to learn from those examples where, despite a completely rigged and racist system, sometimes it works? That's the reason I've been doing this for 30 years, writing books to try and find the exceptional success stories in the context of this. The other example that I think probably flew by too fast at Commonwealth Development in Boston back in the 1980s, they worked with the legal services to get a management contract of 250 pages that gave the resident organization the right to fire a private management company with 30 days notice. I don't know anybody's negotiated anything quite like that since, but it became the best run public housing in the city and remains that way 30 years after redevelopment, and is still 100% very low income people with a much higher rate of people going on to college. So I guess, my question is, where is there space to try and learn from the difficult and hard-fought success stories where communities have taken on this kind of a voice and action and been able to make a difference, working with first-rate designers, working with first-rate legal people, working with first-rate social service agencies, and building a network of people in local government that see it their way and see that they do need to work from the perspective of what local people want. So I think there's examples in Roxbury, Boston, whether it's DSNI or its neighbors in public housing, and it's not the only place. I'm happy to give you other examples. They're too few and too far between, but if we assume that it's just completely untenable to ever do anything worthwhile in these communities, that's not a great answer either. And this week, when we've got a president that's talking about $40 billion going into public housing, well, it's about time. And when AOC says last night, well, fine, but New York City needs all 40 billion. Let's start getting real and figure out what the rest of the country needs. But the conversations are starting to be there, and the examples, far and few, of resident groups and leadership that have had a genuine transfer of power to communities of color are there, and we need to learn from them. That's my point.
Yes, it seems like every day in the news, the conversation about infrastructure keeps popping up. As you heard, Biden wanting to pump $2 trillion into infrastructure, and you get excited, but then again, as you listen to John and Lanesta, you want that money to be used in the right way to benefit, the communities that they're supposed to be helping. We have a question from Gretchen, who says it is, did I get her last name? No, I didn't. But Gretchen is asking or saying it is very problematic that we keep framing the problem in Syracuse as a problem of concentrated poverty. It makes projects like Blueprint 15 seem like the solution. How do we reframe the conversation around poverty itself and concentrated wealth? Each of those reframing would lead to completely different policy priorities. Jan, you want to take this?
Sure, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I know that we've been working to repeal the 45A program, which I know in Syracuse has been used to keep many developers from paying any taxes whatsoever. And so I also think we need to also reframe who is a taxpayer, and even reframing this idea of a developer. And it goes back to colonial land development, this idea that if the development is not for profit, then they're not using the land right. So I think we do really need to reframe it around historical and cultural preservation, and really on reparations, on what was done to this community already, and how this community is already owed a pretty big check of 1,300 homes and 102 acres. And then to the points that were just raised, putting folks in leadership that are going to be able to use that as a foundation to close the racial wealth gap. And that's not an unintentional gap, that it was a gap created to make projects like this look like they are a form of economic development, when really they're just replacing, one economy with another. And I just want to say that with respect to land trust and community control, there is a need for professionals, and there is a need for resources and technical assistance, because it is very difficult for everyday people to manage certain parts of the process, but the process should start with them and be directed by them. So those land trusts are all great examples, and I appreciate the example of public housing in Boston. And so we really should just go there and say, how did this happen? And make that public policy, and make it a guarantee that the mayor, that everybody on that board right now, there's an enormous amount of political power on the board of Blueprint 15, and all of those people can simply offer their power in writing, to the residents, and maybe even take them on a trip over to Boston to talk to some of these folks who've been able to do it. I know that when we built the Fruitvale Community Land Trust, we definitely visited Dudley Street and were really inspired, but I think it's important that people do have resources for technical assistance and to learn, because we're part of what makes these projects seem more viable is that it's a lot easier to work with a bunch of well-educated architects and planners than it is with a community of people, who may have some differences of opinion and may need some time to really figure things out, as compared to, oh, we've got this project, boom, it's ready to go, let's just plug it in and go.
If you don't mind me chiming in really quick, just
Yeah.
just
Lennis.
I do have some information about Blueprint 15, although I'm not personally involved. I guess I could say that I've been on enough calls with them, and also, we did visit. I was a part of a team of folks that went down to look at the purpose-built community in New Orleans. I don't know, maybe 2 years ago at this point. So I do know Blueprint 15 has been site visiting other purpose-built communities. And that's something that I would encourage them to continue. There is obviously lots of work that needs to be done, right? It still needs to be led by the community, and the community still needs to hold those positions of power. But I just kind of wanted to mention that they are trying to engage the community from what I can see and what I can tell. I don't live in that community, so I can't speak from firsthand experience. I speak from a level of being a part of coalitions and being a part of consultation phone calls, but I just kind of wanted to flag that.
Thank you, Lanessa. I want
Can I just add something? I just think that these examples that, as you've, John and Larry have suggested that they're, few and far between, but I think the more visibility that the sort of range of possibilities gets, the better, because, to just think that the only show in town may be the purpose-built community, that, we need to get these models out there so that they become viable alternatives.
Elizabeth, Cohen, while I've got you here, I got a question from Peter King, who's asking, is equitable public health for all part of a viable discourse for planning urban change going forward? And he's including transit access, freedom from highway pollution, parks. How would this impact the power balance?
Well, I would say probably everybody on this call would be in favor of, the provision of good public health for everybody. That's just another kind of insult that we live with. And I think COVID has only brought that to greater attention. And, one wonders when this is over, let's not say if, one certainly hopes that there'll have been some more learning, as much as there's cynicism here about whether one ever does learn. But, this is just, really inexcusable in in a wealthy, advanced Western country, an industrialized country like ours, that we have such a complete patchwork and inequity in our health provision. So that seems like a no-brainer to me. Again, something that costs money. This is, as John has reminded us repeatedly, these are really serious issues of restructuring where resources go, where they come from and where they go in this country. And I don't know. I do feel, though, that I guess here I am more of a gradualist in that I think it's going to be a step at a time. It took Obamacare to even get people to recognize that there was an alternative to a totally private system of insurance. And so, let's hope we continue to take these steps.
I kind of wanted to sneak in a little question here. Of course, you guys know that this project is going on with Syracuse I-81. That's what we're talking about. If do you believe the things that need to be done when it comes to getting the community involved? We've heard about meetings with the Department of Transportation that have been going along, that have been happening. Do you think everything has been done? The state is doing everything they can do, and the city is doing everything and the county is doing everything they can do to get people involved and talk about what needs to be done when it comes to I-81? Do you feel that everything has been done correctly or in a good manner to benefit the people? Or is there something missing that hasn't been done? I'm curious.
So
Anybody?
I'm gonna say to all 126 attendees, no, it's a hard no. Absolutely not. There is a lot of work that the the Department of Transportation has to do. A lot of work, a ton of work. They haven't gone far enough in their proposal to make sure there's an equitable outcome. When I say far enough, I really mean they've done the bare minimum. That's a lot of the work that I do, and why I'm in the community so much, so I can kind of uplift their voice in that conversation with the Department of Transportation. We also submitted a 40-page report. I can share it in the chat if folks want to take a look at it with all of our recommendations. And it really starts with the fact that the Department of Transportation has had a faulty conclusion. And their conclusion is this massive infrastructure project is not going to have an impact on the community. And along with that faulty conclusion, that means they are not obligated by law to do anything to mediate or remediate or mitigate the damages as a result of 7 to 10 years of construction and displacement. So I just want to just be very clear in that answer. The answer is positively no. I will say with a caveat, we haven't seen their new plans, so they could have very well changed. They issued a 3,000-page report 2 summers ago at this point that we read and we digested, and we made a ton of recommendations. We're not sure if they've incorporated those recommendations yet because they haven't shared their revised version. But as of now, what they're doing for the community is absolutely nothing. And that's because they've concluded the community will not be impacted. As far as public participation, that's the process step, right? And so you can hold a lot of meetings and cross a lot of check a lot of boxes, but is it meaningful participation? And are you actually incorporating what people are telling you into the written plan? If it's not incorporated into the written plan, then you're really just doing kind of the bare minimum.
Yeah, I just want to say, look at the board, look at the budgets, look at the grants. That's all you really need to do. And so I think that we wouldn't be having this conversation if they had. And we'll just say this, like I have an 8-year-old son and I talk to him a lot. I engage him a lot. I ask him, what do you want for dinner? What do you want for this? Now, do I give it to him all the time? No, right? So I think to me, this conversation really has to be about how this board of people, the budgets, the grants that they're writing, all of the vehicles for the economic drivers of this process are oriented towards people being able to say no, right? And I don't think that there's anywhere in this entire process where they ask the question that people could legitimately say no to, and that they would actually stop that process or reorganize that process. It's, we're going to engage, but we're going to keep on moving. We're going to keep on churning. And that's what all of us half believed when you said that they were already destroying this thing in the April Fool's joke, because we know that's a possible reality. We know that that's how they move.
Larry or Elizabeth, your thoughts on that? When it comes to, is the city, have they done enough? And if they need to do more, what do they need to do? What, to, take care of the community that they're supposedly trying to take care of?
This is definitely a question that has to be answered by people living in Syracuse. I'm afraid, that even if we'd been able to do this in person and had a tour, I would feel very uncomfortable opining on the complexity of engagement that needs to be here. All I would say is that the track record around the country of this kind of engagement has not been good, and it has been very hard fought by communities to be listened to by the levels of government and especially when there are powerful outside players that are coming in to do this. And I think, the more that the communities in Syracuse look at the experience of other communities whether it's the purpose-built community in Atlanta that was the subject of the recent Burns McMahon film on East Lake Village, or others that I know less about. Those will bring up the good questions about what does it take to really engage and ask the right questions, and to have some capacity to get the best deal if the deal is going to happen. And I think there are examples of people that have negotiated better solutions because the resources are substantial, and nobody wants this to end up in pure animosity. And so the question is to learn from other places that went from suspicion and critique to something where, on balance, the community is glad to have had the investment. And who speaks for that community is a really complicated question. And I hope that there will be opportunities for those voices to be heard, because ultimately, if it doesn't work for people who are there now, it doesn't work for the people who are going to be there in the future.
We have someone, a part of this discussion here, Jeremy Newman, he's making an observation here saying that about the observations when it comes to Blueprint 15, he says that's not true. They didn't say the community wouldn't be affected. They said the environmental impacts would be mitigated during the construction phase. And he's wondering whether there are examples from rural communities that have done innovative things that are inclusive.
So I'm just going to say respectfully, we're talking about two different things. So the question you posed was, with the infrastructure project of I-81, redevelopment of I-81, the highway coming down, are they doing enough, right? So their conclusion, the Department of Transportation's conclusion, that this community will not be impacted socially, economically, or environmentally. That is their conclusion. That is not a mistake. It is written on their website. You can go to I-81 opportunity/DOT, that's the Department of Transportation, and you'll find their draft environmental impact statement. And so in an impact statement, you have to assess all opportunities, right? So it's not just, it's called the environmental impact statement, but it doesn't just limit itself to the environment. Environment also means your health. It also means your social ability. It also means your ability to walk your neighborhood. All of these things are included in that assessment. And so they did determine there's going to be no impact. As far as the Blueprint 15 conclusion, I don't know if they concluded what the impact is going to be for the redevelopment of public housing. That's why I always try to make clear at the top of the conversation, we're talking about two separate things. Blueprint 15 is a redevelopment of public housing. The I-81 project is the redevelopment of a 1.4 mile raised viaduct. There are two different projects held by two different people. I-81 is held by the state, and it's the state's responsibility. Blueprint 15 is a public-private partnership, and is the public and private responsibility of those organizations, right? So those are two separate things. I don't know if Blueprint 15 is in the processing stage to determine what their impact will be. I don't know that. I haven't heard anything about that yet. I have my ears pretty close to the ground. I don't know that. What I do know is the redevelopment project of the highway has said there will be no impact, absolute, to this community as a result of the construction and redevelopment. One caveat to that is where these two intersect is when the viaduct comes down and the community grid is now our new way of getting from point A to point B. This will open up almost 18 acres of land. So that is the crux of the conversation. In 5 to 7 years, or in 7 to 10 years, how long this construction project happens, when it's all said and done, there will be 18 acres of land in the city's center, ready and available for redevelopment. And so not only are we saying as an organization, the NYCLU, that yes, in fact, this community will be impacted by construction, right? The immediate safety and health of them will be impacted by construction. We're also saying that there is I don't want to use legal terms, there is a connection between when the redevelopment happens of I-81 and the community grid is there, that 18 acres of land will create gentrification, resulting in the displacement of people. Much like what happened in Rochester in the inner loop, when land becomes available in the center of the city that they have not seen in 60 years, it's going to be like a gold rush. It is in close proximity to Syracuse University. It is in close proximity to ESF. It is in close proximity to one of our major employers, Upstate University Hospital and Golisano Hospital. So we know that there is a high demand for development in that area. Our concern is a vulnerable population that lives adjacent to it, and what's going to happen to them as the property taxes go up, as their rent start to inflate. This is the crux of gentrification. So not only is the redevelopment of I-81, the viaduct, going to have an impact on the community in the immediate, we're really looking like a slow leak of displacement. What we saw in the 1950s was jarring because it happened overnight, right? 5-year construction plan, 1,300 families removed, 101 acres gone, right? It was a mass movement. This is going to happen more slowly, which also makes it more devious and harder to track, right? Because now we don't know who's moving because they can't afford it, whose property taxes have tripled or doubled and they're on limited income. So there's a real concern here. So I just want to be very clear that we understand there's an impact as a result of the infrastructure project, the I-81 infrastructure project. We don't know the impact of Blueprint 15 because Blueprint 15 is going to happen no matter what. That's not true because the community could stop it. It will happen regardless if that viaduct comes down or not. If that viaduct stays, this project may happen, or if the viaduct goes, this project may happen. So just to be very clear, there are 2 separate projects happening in the same community that will both impact this community.
Thank you, Lanessa. We've actually run over our time, but I'm just going to allow each of you panelists, Cohen, Vail, Lanessa, and Washington, I'm going to let you guys give a very brief and quick final thought. And we'll start with Elizabeth Cohen. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just say that I've learned a lot. I wish we were supposed to be in Syracuse and see all this on the ground, which didn't obviously happen. But I would just say it was very helpful, Lanessa, to have you lay out these projects. And yet, as an outsider looking in, they are very entangled. And it's very clear that people are going to be watching. It puts even more pressure on the Blueprint 15 project to know that those 18 acres are going to arise if this highway, comes down and that land is opened up. So, one would hope in an ideal world that there would be, these projects would actually get looked at together. And because inevitably they are impacting each other.
Larry Vail, go ahead. Your final thoughts, briefly.
Really, just that I'm hopeful that there can be some kind of a careful community process to try and rebuild some trust, and to have the kinds of conversations with trusted facilitators and moderators, so that this doesn't feel as imposed from outside, and brings together the impacts of the 2 projects on one another and on the people, and allows some of that history to be brought into the conversation, and makes it possible so that the understandable anger and mistrust that has built up and over remembered injustices as well as current ones can be part of a constructive conversation to bring forward something that will make a better next neighborhood. And if we learn from places that said, look, they're this many people here now, and if you're only going to add, you're going to have a certain number of housing units in the mixed income community, you can subtract from that and figure out how many people are not going to be welcome to come back no matter how much they want to. And you can figure out what sorts of desirable institutions need to come, what sorts of shops and for whom. And you'll get pretty quickly clear who this is for and who it's not for if you do that. And so these kind of conversations, have to happen in person over time and seriously, and I hope they will.
Vanessa, your brief final thought?
I think I took up some space. I think I will pass my brief final thought and just thank you for the very informative conversation. I'm looking forward. I've already connected with some of you via email during this conversation. I'm really interested to learn more from you all. So thank you for that.
Thank you. John Washington.
Yeah, I just want to say that this has been an amazing conversation. And I really want to challenge everyone to never say the word segregation without apartheid again. I want to challenge all of academia to start writing more about the history of American apartheid and housing from the perspective of the people who experienced it. And I want to say that I think that all white folks really need to recognize that this is what it looks like for your wealth to be built on top of our oppression. Because what's going to happen is it's probably going to go through, and a lot of folks are going to make a whole lot of money. And 10 years from now, no one, unless we write about it, is going to remember what this community looked like before these things happened. And we really need to really have that conversation about what racism looks like now. This is white wealth being dropped on Black lives, and I think that we need to start bringing the Black Lives Matter conversation into housing.
And I would just like to lastly say that this is, what's happening here in Syracuse with I-81. It's kind of like, it's kind of like that movie that you're watching, and you just hope those visionaries and the people involved in the process just do the right thing, just search their heart and think about the people that they're going to have an impact on. And in the end, they just do the right thing and it's a happy ending, but we know that doesn't always happen. But again, I just want to thank you so much, Elizabeth Cohen, Lawrence Vail, Vanessa Chaplin, John Washington, for joining us in with this discussion. And if you want to continue the discussion, those of you who have been watching and paying attention, we want to be a part of this continuing discussion. You can follow us on Instagram. All you have to do is search City Scripts on Instagram, or you can email them at cityscripts@syr.edu. That's Syracuse Education there. cityscripts@syr.edu. If you would like to be a part of the Small Talks video discussion about I-81, you can also write an email, cityscripts@syr.edu. We are looking for neighborhood interviewers who would like to get involved, and you can do that as well by emailing us at that email address that I just gave you, cityscripts@syr.edu. That's all we have for tonight. Again, big thank you, and hopefully this conversation will have an impact on what happens when it comes to I-81. Thanks again, everybody.